Hi, I'm Lisa Hoffman. I'm joined today by Emily Suh and Alan Zollman, and we're going to be sharing our presentation, Distinguishing Mistakes from Errors, Addressing Essential STEM Processing Skills for Student Success. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see our presentation. So success in STEM coursework requires more than mastering content. Educators recognize that students also can learn much from their errors, not just from the things that they get correct. In this presentation, we draw upon applied linguistics research to present the critical difference between mistakes and errors, and to introduce strategies for addressing both in the classroom.
So we base the premise of our paper on the fact that educators already know and acknowledge the value of learning from mistakes. And indeed, we recognize that mistakes are even necessary or essential for STEM learning. What we wonder, though, is what can STEM education researchers learn from the field of applied linguistics, in other words, language learning research, about the importance of differentiating mistakes from errors and the need to treat them differently in the classroom. So what practical steps can educators take in order to maximize the educational benefit of addressing student mistakes and errors in the classroom?
In our previous work, we explored the intersection of applied linguistics and STEM education research with emergent multilingual students and professional development needs of their STEM teachers. In this presentation, we're exploring how a key concept of second language learning could be applied to STEM learning to provide a useful conceptual tool for STEM teachers.
So this is a table from an earlier article in 2016 about what STEM teachers need to know and do for English language learners, or ELLs. So previously, we had looked at how STEM educators can look at language learning needs of students and the STEM learning needs of students, and how those interact or how those compare. So when we look at the types of language that a student needs to learn when learning English, for example, there are some parallels to the kind of language and literacy skills that students need to learn in STEM disciplines. So in this presentation, we translate the concept of student mistakes and errors from the field of applied linguistics, which is again, language learning research, to learning in STEM. And we highlight the importance of recognizing whether students' challenges are the result of a random guess or a mistake in a procedure or a repeated misapplication of a rule or a concept. What is causing the problem? And is it important to differentiate the problems that students have in order to understand the way we should address these separate issues? And we're arguing that it is helpful to look at those differences, and then in this way, STEM educators can learn from language educators.
In language learning and applied linguistics, a mistake is referred to as a performance error that's either a random guess or a slip. An error, on the other hand, is persistent use of non-standard language and reveals a shortcoming in understanding or in the concept and competency of the language learner.
H. Douglas Brown, the applied linguist, talks about the difference between mistakes and errors, explaining a mistake refers to a performance error that is either a random guess or a slip, in that it is a failure to utilize a known system correctly. Mistakes, when attention is called to them, can be self-corrected. Mistakes must be carefully distinguished from errors of a second language learner, idiosyncrasies in the language of the learner that are direct manifestations of a system within which a learner is operating at the time. An error, a notable deviation from the adult grammar of a native speaker, reflects the competence of a learner. In other words, while a mistake is just something that we say offhand without thinking about it, or when we actually do know the rule, an error happens when we have internalized an incorrect rule. So examples of mistakes and errors from language learning would include something like a multilingual individual who accidentally inverts similar sounding words in a conversation. For example, comí el jabón, I ate the soup, instead of comí el jamón, I ate the ham, right? Or in English, I ate lunch in the chicken instead of I ate lunch in the kitchen. A multilingual, on the other hand, who does not yet know how to conjugate verbs in the past perfect tense would be making an error. Había comí en la cocina instead of había comido en la cocina. In other words, I had ate lunch in the kitchen instead of I ate lunch in the kitchen.
There are many words that teachers, parents, and students use to describe mistakes and errors. Our main concern is the conceptual errors in STEM, and that we respond differently to errors than to mistakes.
So here's an example related to STEM disciplines. Think about a student who's using a calculator. How does a calculator deal with mistakes and errors? When a student's using a calculator, does that affect their likelihood of making errors or their likelihood of making mistakes? And our answer is that a calculator can help students avoid a miscalculation, so a mistake, but a calculator won't help with conceptual misunderstandings, which would be an error. So you can misuse a calculator or make a mistake with a calculator, but ideally, a calculator is helping a student avoid mistakes, but it won't necessarily help with avoiding errors.
I worked with a fourth grade teacher that every time I asked the students questions in mathematics, she kept correcting their inaccurate responses. She treated every inaccurate response as a mistake, and she didn't allow students to learn from their conceptual errors.
Unmute. Making connections. When we see a connection between educators' treatment of mistakes or errors and educators' focus on getting the right answer or understanding connections.
So here's an example of a middle school or high school problem in mathematics. And so which was correct? You see the response from a student. Is this a mistake or is this an error that they're doing? And looking at the work, you can't tell. We have to probe the students' thinking. Is this a procedural error that they're just writing things wrong and they know better? Or is this a conceptual error that they don't understand that we're taking the cube root and taking it to the fifth power? Then we go on to trig and we have a common error that we see, or is it a common mistake? And so the first is a variable is squared, and the second one is the function is squared. So does the students notice that this is a different concept that's going on, or are they just being, very lazy or just sloppy in their thing? And the other thing that happens, of course, is did the teacher say this correctly? Because a lot of times the teachers will just say sine x squared or sine squared x. Do they say it correctly so that they see the difference between a variable and a function and that the students can understand this concept? Or do they just say it for a procedure?
So when do we address mistakes and errors? In applied linguistics, we address errors and mistakes when we're working with emergent multilingual students. And language teachers who have done this don't typically have training in TESOL or ESL. So they spend a lot of time highlighting all of the mistakes that their learners make. In other words, mistakes in second language learning can be one-off issues. They're made out of haste, just a slip of the tongue. And language educators are noting those mistakes, but they have to decide when they are persistent enough that that the mistake needs to be corrected. Mistakes are only a concern in language learning if they become fossilized or if they become a habit. A fossilized mistake can ultimately become an error if it doesn't get corrected and it turns into what part of someone's individual, their grammar inside their head.
So when and why do mistakes and errors need to be treated differently in STEM learning? And the answer is anytime accuracy and precision are needed. There are instances where a mistake can be ignored and overlooked in STEM. Of course, mistakes made out of haste or in the need of master skills that require specific steps. But how do an educator address mistakes and errors most constructively? And when do we need to sweat the small stuff? When is it small potatoes and when is it important?
In terms of when to address errors and mistakes in STEM and the procedure, we would encourage educators to look at it this way. When a student gives a wrong response, focus first on errors. Do students understand the concept? Then, if you can determine that students do understand the concept, then check for procedural mistakes. Is this the final product or is this a draft? So in STEM, we need to develop the disposition to work methodically and carefully and allow mistakes. And what we mean here is on the part of educators, but also on the part of students. Students do need to learn the disposition of working carefully. That's part of being able to be competent in STEM. And that precision and accuracy are vital, but we would argue they're not the first thing to address with students. They're not the primary importance.
To address errors and mistakes in the classroom, we first want to make sure that before we're correcting students, we understand their thinking. So probe students' thinking to determine whether it was actually a mistake or if it was an error. The next thing that we need to do is reframe errors as learning opportunities. Rather than telling a student what they got wrong, if we walk through the answer that they gave, we can understand what led them to make that choice and they can correct their thinking. Errors, in fact, have been proven to provide evidence of learning. And this was because when students are able to see the strategies and procedures that they're using, they can think about how they have understood that procedural knowledge. So we need to look for the logic in students' errors, and this will help us reveal the source of their conceptual misunderstanding. Finally, we only address mistakes after students have learned from their errors.
So what do we do as educators? Well, when we work in the classroom with the student, we mention things over and over again to help them feel comfortable about making errors and learning from errors and fixing their mistakes. And so we say things like learning takes time. Help me understand your thinking. Let's think about this for a moment. And so what did we learn as reflecting back on the error or on the mistake?
Now, there are some limitations to this approach, and we should note there's some key differences between the field of applied linguistics and STEM disciplines. So in language learning, for example, mistakes and errors are only a major concern when they impede communication or comprehension. By the nature of language and the function of language being a mode of communication, second language teachers really don't sweat the small stuff in terms of mistakes or even errors if they're not actually impeding communication or comprehension. If we contrast this with mathematics, for example, errors and mistakes are both concerns. Errors show lack of understanding a concept, and mistakes can show haste or sloppiness in following procedures. And in mathematics, as with many other STEM disciplines, we really can't just overlook errors and mistakes because those will affect students' ability to move forward in their learning.
We don't want bridges and buildings collapsing. So the idea that precision and accuracy are important definitely come through in STEM education, but only at the end of working with concepts. We also would suggest that if you would like to know more about this or are working on projects similar to this, to contact us. And one of our articles, What STEM Teachers Need to Know and Do for English Language Learners, in the Journal of STEM Teacher Education, is an open access journal. And we suggest that if this is of interest to you, that you go to the journal and download our article.
Thank you for working with us through this, and we look forward to hearing your reactions, your thoughts, and perhaps future collaboration as we look further into the connections and the comparisons between different types of learning, in particular, learning language and learning STEM disciplines. Thank you.
Thank you.